pictures from elsewhere in the world where people were already wearing masks and how strange it seemed. And even if it seems strange now, even if we're still not completely comfortable with it, it's just amazing to watch us adapt and evolve. So it's my honor to be here to talk about how do we continue to build our resiliency and support our creativity, which I'll get to why those two things go together later in the talk. But let's start with what used to be the first slide in my presentation.
You reading, Z? Good.
Whoops. This used to be the first slide of my presentation because it was important to address why there was so much anxiety. I think we can probably all agree that it's not so necessary to spend a lot of time on that right now. The reality is that when I used to do this presentation pre-pandemic, what I talked about is if you look at this slide, the safety needs and the love and belonging are parts of our culture that have been challenged since 9/11. In fact, Brene Brown, if you're not familiar with her, is a teacher and an author and a presenter. She is a social worker, doctorate level social worker from the University of Houston, Texas, where she still teaches and does a lot of research on shame and vulnerability. But she talks about how since 9/11, our country has really been in a collective state of post-traumatic stress disorder. And the collective state of post-traumatic stress raises our vigilance, and it's damaged our connection, and it's caused more fear of others, and it's compromised some significant pieces of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is largely why I would talk about there being anxiety. Again, I think given how our lives have been impacted by this pandemic this year and by myriad other challenges and stressors that have been unavoidable, we can't really escape them, that's really where all of our anxiety has come from, in addition to all the other stuff that we worried about before the pandemic. So this is Brene Brown, and the very beginning of the pandemic, she started a podcast, which was a serendipitous thing. She was not planning on launching it right in the face of a pandemic, but that's what happened. And so her first episode was about FFTs, which she uses a more colorful word for the first F, but for the purposes of this family-friendly evening, we're going to call them fabulous first times. And I will let you figure out what she calls them. But she talked about how anytime we're facing something that is brand new for us, it's a brand new experience, something that we've never faced before, that this is an FFT and we have to have some different expectations for ourselves, beginning with normalizing discomfort. There is nothing about this last year that has been comfortable, not at all. There's been a lot of discomfort. And number two, putting things into perspective, being careful with this, because all of that discomfort doesn't mean that the minutia of our daily lives are not still irritants, stressors, that they can't bring us joy in the face of all of the stuff that we're struggling with. In fact, one of my favorite lines from a poem is by the poet Jack Gilbert, and the poem is Brief for the Defense. And the line is, we must have the stubbornness to accept our gladness in the ruthless furnace of this world. Speaking to the reality that no matter what is going on, we are engaging in our life every day. We're not waiting for things to go back to normal. We don't have to brace ourselves all the time out of fear. We have to figure out how to live our lives on a daily basis in this state of a global pandemic and other things that are inducing understandable anxiety. So normalizing that discomfort, putting things into perspective, remembering that we don't need to belittle the things that we're going through as compared to, but perspective is helpful. And then lastly, reality check expectations. I want you to think about this for a second, because I preach this all the time and I don't do a very good job at it. So if you think about the past year, maybe if you think about the last 24 hours, and you think about how much of a hard time you've given yourself for any number of things, whether it's your job or parenting or how clean your house is or how you're managing your own emotions or a whole laundry list of things that we can give ourselves a hard time for, that we have to remember that we're doing the best we can. And if there are things that we can improve upon, great, but we have to start from a place of recognizing that we are doing a pretty darn good job, that we are doing the best we can to take care of ourselves, to take care of our families, and we can strive to do that more effectively, which is why we're here tonight. But we can't do that with shame. We can't do that by judging ourselves. And I will speak more to exactly why in a little bit. I keep forgetting that I have to click on the slide. So let's talk about quarantining together. Emotions are contagious. This is something that I talked about in my previous presentation, that when we look at each other, and if we were in an audience together, I would invite you to do this activity. So if you are watching this with someone, feel free to go and try it while I'm explaining it. But if you look at somebody and one of you decides, okay, I'm going to try to maintain a completely blank neutral face while the other person looks at me right in the eyes, smiling at me as warmly as possible, I guarantee you, you're not going to maintain a neutral face for more than 5 seconds. It is incredibly challenging. We pass emotions between us because of mirror neurons. That's why babies reflect our facial expressions. So we already know that gifted individuals have heightened sensitivity to others' energy. We already know that gifted individuals feel things more intensely. Now let's put us all in a house together, not able to go anywhere to diffuse any of it. And it's not like we're all just living together. We're also on screens engaging with other communities and getting off of those screens from engaging with those communities, possibly having absorbed other people's energy. And it can feel a lot like bumper cars in our home, where everybody's energy is just bumping up against each other. And we can just feel like, why can't everything just be easy? But it's not, because we're human beings. And when we are all together without any breaks, it's intense, especially when you have that heightened sensitivity and intensity. And this emotional contagion can impact people up to 3 degrees of separation from you and within your social network, which we still have social networks, even though we're not interacting with people as much. Many people have gone back to work, at least part-time. Maybe there's limited amounts of people, employees in the offices or your places of employment, but young people have gone back to school, hybrid. So we're beginning to interact with people. Even though we have masks on, the emotions are still contagious because we read them in our eyes. So if you smile at someone with a mask on, they're still going to be able to tell that you're smiling. But when we get off those screens from school or from work, the 1 degree of separation is you, the 2nd degree is your family. And then let's say your child or you or your partner has a phone call with a friend or a FaceTime call with family. You can then spread it that way too. So we have to be really aware of our own emotional state and recognize that there's no way for us to pretend that we are just okay, nor should we be pretending that we're just okay. We have to normalize the experience, normalize discomfort, as we just talked about. So when I talk about overexcitabilities and the dilemmas that they cause, the empathy dilemma is huge for the reasons that I just spoke to. The empathy dilemma is a result of emotional overexcitability. It's a result of imaginational overexcitability, because when you have a really vivid imagination, when you read other people's facial expressions, you might misunderstand them. You might tell yourself a story, so you're picking up on it because of the emotional overexcitability. You're misinterpreting it because of the imaginational overexcitability. It's very challenging. And prior to being in private practice, I was an interventionist at Fairview High School in Boulder, which has over 2,000 students. And I learned very quickly that I could not go out into the hallway during passing period, or else I would be spending probably the next hour or so trying to figure out what is my emotion and what did I absorb from somebody else. And that can be incredibly challenging, especially when you have fewer places to diffuse your energy. A lot of young people that I work with right now, they might be going back to school, but they can't go to their climbing practice because the rock climbing gym isn't open yet. Or they're a theater student and they can't do any live productions because of COVID. Or they're music or singing student and those are their strengths. Or they're an athlete. And those are the ways that we diffuse our emotional energy. We don't have access to a lot of that right now. So the empathy dilemma is one that causes a buildup of emotional energy in our bodies. And we have to be vigilant about releasing that energy, or else what happens is we fill up because our bodies are a finite container. And then we either lash in with behaviors or words, or we lash out with behaviors or words. And neither of those things help in any way to soften the edges of the discomfort that we're feeling. One of the things that I have spoken in many capacities about in lots of different presentations with different specific subjects is the existential dilemma that comes with being gifted, that comes with an overactive mind. And one thing that we are really good at as gifted individuals is overthinking. And the world gives us a lot of things to overthink. So when we talk about the post-traumatic stress of 9/11, another thing that we have had to wrestle with, particularly generations born since then, is pre-traumatic stress around climate change and around the future of our country, the future of our world. Well, if we add to that the fact that what the pandemic has done is taken away our sense of certainty and control. So looking at this slide for a moment, Anne Lamott is a writer, and I love this quote of hers, that the opposite of faith is not doubt. The opposite of faith is in fact certainty. And at the very beginning of the pandemic, I was scrolling on social media, and to be perfectly honest, I cannot remember for the life of me who posted this. I have Googled this quote numerous times. I can't find it anywhere. So my apologies to the person out there who came up with this quote, and it is not mine, though I love it, is that with this pandemic, we were all facing withdrawal from the emotional addiction to the myths of certainty and control. And that just blew my mind. Because if you think about it, control and certainty are two of the things that as human beings carry us forward, right? Controlling our future, trying to erase things in the past that we try to change or forget, and really dependent on certainty as something that will take care of our anxiety as though it's even possible. We have no certainty about anything. We don't even know how our dinner will turn out in spite of our best efforts. So we have to be able to get comfortable with the reality that we are not in control of as many things as we think we are, that we cannot guarantee our certainty. When you're someone who already struggles with the existential dilemma of what that means and who has leaned into controlling behaviors as a method of trying to quell some of that anxiety, and if you're sitting there thinking, oh, I don't control, let me invite you to join me in the vulnerability of recognizing your own perfectionism if you are someone who is a perfectionist, because that in and of itself is a way to try to control. So this pre-traumatic or post-traumatic stress plus pre-traumatic stress that's bookended young people's generations since 2001, as well as how it's impacted all of us who remember what life was like pre-9/11. And now we add a pandemic to that. We are wrestling with this feeling of powerlessness. Many people are wrestling with powerlessness. That's what I talk about most with most of my clients on a daily basis. And it creates and exacerbates the existential dilemma, which is already this feeling of being this tiny little dust speck. I used to have all these students from Earth, Space, Geo, a science class at Fairview. They would show up in my office after class and go, if we're just a tiny dust speck on this rock hurling through space, why do I have to do my math homework? Well, that's an excellent question, but we do regardless. How do we navigate that question? How do we navigate the myriad questions that are coming up for all of us about what we're facing, what we continue to face, what our future looks like? So one other quote that I heard that I really loved, and it's another one that I must just have friends on Facebook that are really well spoken, because I can't find this quote when I Google it, but again, not mine, is that the opposite of hopelessness is not hopefulness, it's curiosity. The opposite of hopelessness is not hopefulness, it's curiosity. That was liberating to me to hear, because I am not someone who wants to force optimism and positivity on anyone, including myself. We have to normalize discomfort. We have to destigmatize talking about our fears and how it feels hopeless right now. But when you think about how curiosity and certainty work together, we can't be curious about anything if we think we're absolutely certain of something. But if we maintain curiosity, it helps soften the edges of hopelessness because it offers us a possibility. If we're not certain about any outcome, then we can't be certain about negative outcomes. But the worst case scenario dilemma, which I'll talk about in a moment, is another piece of being gifted. It's another piece of being human. that we think that we can predict disaster, but we don't give ourselves the same right to predict that things might go well. So when I talk to parents, and I have a 14-year-old, so I'm well aware of what it's like to be going through this experience of the pandemic as an individual and as a parent. When my daughter is seeking reassurance from me, I don't offer her platitudes. I tell her that this is a scary time. I understand that we have each other and that we can be scared together. I don't try to answer unanswerable questions. I let her know that I wonder with her. So when my daughter was 4, and this is a story I often tell when I'm introducing myself at the beginning of a talk about how I ended up working specifically with gifted individuals, because I was gifted when I was younger, right? I was gifted because it's an educational label. So I didn't really know much about giftedness as a psychological phenomenon until my daughter was born and old enough that she could be demonstrating traits of giftedness. But I was working in Fairview at the time, and I was on a walk with my daughter one day, and she said to me out of the blue at 4 years old, "Mama, I don't know if it's God or Jesus or Buddha or the universe, but why are we people and not horses?" We'll talk about a difficult question. That is a child asking her parent what higher power actually exists. Should she believe in it? Is there evolution? All kinds of questions. I had no idea how to answer. And fortunately, my instinct was to simply say, wow, those are really big questions. I wonder those things too. And the next day when I went to work and I talked to my very dear friend who happened to be the gifted coordinator for Fairview High School, she said that's exactly how we should respond. That the solace that our children will find in knowing that they're not alone in not knowing, and that it's okay to not know, that the adults in their life can find their way through the discomfort of not having certainty, that we can find our way through the discomfort of not having control, which means we have to contend with that ourselves. We can't offer platitudes. We can't just reassure. We can't put a smile on our face and pretend that we're okay, and then behind closed doors try to process what we're feeling, because our children are so highly sensitive. Our partners are highly sensitive. We know when the people around us are covering up their feelings, and that does not help anyone, because when we don't share our feelings, it gives the message that that's not okay to do. When we step into vulnerability, it offers permission to everyone around us to do the same. One of the other things that's been really prominent in my world and in my work since the start of the pandemic has been comparative suffering. This sense that some people who have kind of survivor's guilt, feeling bad that they are experiencing any discomfort because perhaps their income hasn't been impacted, or for whatever reason, they feel like they have not been as impacted as others have been. Meanwhile, on the other end, there are people who are suffering deeply who might question whether or not people who have more have a right to be complaining. None of this helps us. It corrodes connection, it corrodes compassion. We already have connection corroded since 9/11, as I spoke to a moment ago. And later in my presentation, you're going to hear why connection is so deeply important to us. So that comparative suffering is just one more thing that divides us. And it also really exacerbates the moral dilemma that so many young people have who are gifted, any gifted individuals, it's not just young people, that why do bad things happen to good people? Why do things happen to people good things happen to people that don't deserve them? Why are there these inequities? So sitting with moral ambiguity, especially for young children, is really challenging. And we have a much harder time protecting our children from the onslaught of information about all of the suffering that's happening in the world because of the technology that they have access to, because of the fact that they are on devices for school. We can't avoid that. Meanwhile, when I was growing up, there was no internet. So news stories were something that we learned about in the evening news or the morning news or in the newspaper. And it was easier for parents to kind of control and filter how and when their children learned about things and engage in conversation with them that allowed them to kind of process and work through their challenging thoughts and feelings about it. That doesn't happen anymore. There is a lot of consumption of information that's involuntary. And so the moral ambiguity that young people and all gifted individuals are struggling with, all human beings truly, is huge right now. The worst case scenario dilemma, I already kind of touched on this, so I'll be brief. But let's just say in my family, I'm not allowed to look at WebMD any longer. Anytime I am feeling ill, it is just off the table because I will jump to the worst possible conclusion. In fact, I heard a comedian just yesterday saying they should rename WebMD it's probably cancer.com because that's what we all jump to is the worst case scenario. So remembering that if we don't have certainty, then there's no way to know if the worst case scenario or the best case scenario is what's going to manifest. And this is important. I do want to share this piece, even though I want to be brief on this, that earlier in the pandemic, I had a young client who was racked with fear. And I asked her to tell me why. And she told me all of the things that she was afraid of, all of the worst case scenarios in her head. And when she was done sharing that, I asked her, how does your body feel when you think about all of those worst case scenarios? And she explained the physiological feeling of stress, that her stomach was all in knots, that she felt kind of sweaty and shaky and cold, and that her mind started to race. We talked about that for a minute. And I said, okay, let's just pretend for a minute that we can manifest the best case scenario. What would the best case scenario be? And when she told me what she envisioned as the best case scenario, I asked her, what does your body feel like now when you're telling me? And not surprisingly, it was markedly different. And so we had a subsequent conversation about how, no, we have no way of predicting that everything's going to be okay, but we also have no way of predicting that it's not. And if that's the case, and if we have control in some way of what the inside of our body feels like while we're waiting to know with curiosity what happens, then it feels like it might be better, more beneficial to us to lean into the best case scenario. And again, I'll expand more on that in a moment. The boredom dilemma is another thing that so many are struggling with this year. It's already challenging as a gifted student to be in school and feel like the working conditions are out of focus with their basic needs. And as you'll see in this quote, when working conditions are out of focus with one's basic needs, it usually manifests in irritability, withdrawal, rebellious opposition, aggressive rejection. And so that's already a challenge in education. I've noticed, and you might notice this too, that for some gifted learners, this has actually been a really lovely change. For some gifted learners, the lack of stimulation from being in their school buildings, the ability to do things more on their own time has been really positive. But for some, that lack of stimulation has been incredibly challenging. So we're also dealing with how this kind of minimization of the scope of our lives has impacted us. That we've gone from having these lives that take place on sports fields and auditoriums and in our school buildings and wherever else we are to a screen and our home. And maybe 1 or 2 days a week we get out. So that's a huge challenge for so many. The means to an end dilemma. This goes back kind of with the existential dilemma and the certainty about the future. If we have no certainty, then we can't be following a blueprint that promises to have an end result because we don't know what's going to happen at all, ever. Why I have the IB learner profile up here is when I was working at Fairview, I had a young man in my office right after spring break of his senior year at very high risk, deeply depressed because he had done everything he could to do all the things he needed to do to get into an Ivy League school, including getting the IB diploma, getting over a 4.0 GPA, being involved in everything, doing all of the things, checking all the boxes, dotting all the I's, crossing all the T's. Not only did he not get into any of the Ivy League schools, but the only school he got into was CU Boulder, which for whatever reason felt like a huge disappointment to him. To him, his future was over. When I asked him if the IB curriculum's focus on being a global thinker and a global citizen and a critical thinker and a problem solver gave any value to that curriculum, to his engagement in it, if he went back to his freshman year, would he still have done it knowing that it wouldn't get him into an Ivy League school? His answer was no. And to me, I thought, wow, that's 4 years of this young man's life that he's now going to feel he wasted. So we talk a lot this year about getting back to normal. You hear people talking about that all the time. And the author Sonia Renee Taylor, who wrote The Body is Not an Apology, talks about how there is no going back to normal. We're stitching a new garment. That when we move forward into our collective and individual futures, that we have the opportunity to do things differently. And one of the things that I think would benefit us all greatly is to move on from that means to an end thinking. Because again, it's attached and intertwined with this certainty and control, that we have to move more towards curiosity and engaging in our daily life now, learning to learn, being of service to be of service, not doing things for what we might get in return. And that's not something that I think we all do consciously, but it's a systemic and a societal culture that we've lived in. The messages that we continue to send, and if you've seen me before, you know that I talk about this in my old resiliency presentation, which is why I added continue, because in spite of all of the challenges, these are messages we continue to send in spite of how our world has changed, in spite of how the circumstances of our lives and our children's lives have changed. When I say we, I mean society. So please don't take this personally, because you might not be making this statement in your own home, but we still expect everyone to be amazing at everything they do. Figure out how to transcend the limitations of the quarantine and just do it. Avoid new ventures, especially where you might fail. Maybe the opening to making sourdough bread and learning new instruments that we all felt at the beginning of the pandemic seemed like an invitation to try new things, even if you do fail. But you don't see people sharing those failures on social media. You see people sharing their successes. And you hear a lot of people saying, I wish I could learn a new instrument. I wish I could learn a new foreign language, but I suck, or I can't do it, or I don't have time. So we continue to wrestle with that shame and that fear that we're going to fail. We're not going to be successful. What you accomplish matters more than what you learn. If there was ever a time for us to drop into the experience and benefit of learning for learning's sake, now would be it. Having lots of choices equals control over your life. I think I've already harped on control quite a bit. You must find your life's passion by high school. Let me tell you about an interesting phenomenon that I have experienced with my own daughter, as well as many of my clients. A lot of young people who have been forced to press pause on the things that they have maybe been passionate about since they were a child are now wrestling with the question, am I really passionate about this? Or is it just what I've done my whole life and I never stopped to think, do I really want to continue? It's an interesting phenomenon because the message, you have to find your life's passion by high school, has caused a lot of young people to hold on for dear life to things that feel dissonant to them, that no longer feel congruent with who they are or what they want for themselves. But that message allows or sends this, it sends this idea that if you get to high school and you're starting to question whether or not you want to continue doing whatever that passion is, you might be in trouble because you're supposed to already be honing that passion. And that's not true at all. And everyone is doing, being, and succeeding more than you. I think that is even worse right now because all these young people and many of us have is social media. That's all we see is what people want to present. So even more than before when we were going to our workplaces and to our schools together, we are hiding behind, or not intentionally, I don't mean to suggest that, but we're all behind that veil where we can choose what to share. In fact, my friends and I are often joking that we never actually comb the back of our hair, which isn't really true, but you're always on screen. We're always just seeing the front. We're always seeing the highlight reel. We're never seeing the behind the scenes. So things to really be aware of, because we've built a world that's a reflection of our belief that we're not enough. And again, this is Sonia Renee Taylor, who wrote The Body is Not an Apology, who I cited a moment ago. We operate in this fear that we are not enough and that there is not enough. And that scarcity mentality started long before 2020, which is why we have a perfectionism dilemma. Perfectionism is not the same as striving for excellence. It is absolutely different because perfectionism is a way that we try to minimize or avoid the pain of blame, judgment, and shame. Perfectionism is fear in fancy clothing, and it leads to a lot of procrastination. And I will tell you, if there were an Olympics for procrastination, I would be a multiple gold winner. And the fact of the matter is, I'm successful when I procrastinate. I'm still able to get things done. And so it makes it really hard for me to change that behavior. But I have my own therapist, and I reckon with my own dark places on a regular basis. And I am well aware that this is my fear of not being good enough. I am well aware that I'm addicted to that feeling of fear, that adrenaline that comes right before something is due or I have to do something that drives me, and it's unhealthy. So we have to recognize how procrastination and perfectionism go hand in hand and how damaging that is to our development of resiliency. The last dilemma that I'm going to talk about before we talk about what to do about all of this is the baseline dilemma. And I love this quote from Dr. Bill Damon, the director of Stanford Center on Adolescence, that the biggest problem growing up today is not actually stress, it's meaninglessness. And this is something that I hear a lot of young people that I work with struggling with this year in particular. There's more hope, it seems, in the last week. But the reality is that pre and post-traumatic stress has caused a lot of questions about what is the purpose, what is the meaning of our life. And I highly, highly recommend, if you have not read it or your child has not read it, Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, which has a young adult edition as well. It is absolutely brilliant. And Viktor Frankl, who is a Holocaust survivor and who I'll be quoting momentarily, writes about his experience surviving the Holocaust, but he was also a psychologist at the time that he was imprisoned. He was a psychologist. And he developed, out of his experience in the Holocaust, a type of therapy called logotherapy, which is entirely designed around figuring out how to find meaning and purpose in one's life. I cannot speak to why this is important enough. And I'm going to tell you why I called it the baseline dilemma. Because I saw a speaker once by the name of Rob Bell, who talked about how in music, you are attuned to hearing the melody and the harmony. We don't really pay attention to the bass line unless it drops out. Then we notice its absence. In our lives, the melody and the harmony are the minutia, the to-do lists, the things that we do every day. We don't pay attention to that sense of purpose and meaning unless it's absent, and then we feel its absence. So this is an incredibly important part of resiliency. And I'll speak a little bit more to how we'll get there in just a moment. So what do ducks have to do with this? We know that ducks look like they're gliding and floating on the water as they move, when the reality is they're paddling furiously underneath. And in our society, this is something that we do all the time. We hide our paddling furiously because of shame, because we are afraid that people will see that we are less than we put ourselves out there to be. They will recognize that we are just imposters, that we don't actually know what we're doing. But one of the things that I have found over the years of presenting is that when I stand up in front of parents and say, I have my own therapist, I lose my temper at my child, I preach all this stuff, but I struggle deeply with procrastination. I struggle deeply with knowing how to set boundaries and how to not people please. People come up to me at the end and they care far less about the content, the psychoeducational content that I shared, and far more about the fact that I'm a human being. I'm a human being willing to share my vulnerability and therefore allowing people to feel less alone in theirs. So resilience is the process of adapting well in the face of significant ongoing stressors, which we're all experiencing. You may also have experienced adversity, trauma, or tragedy this year, in addition to those significant ongoing stressors. And here's the thing about resilience. We're not born with it. It is a learned skill to learn how to manage stress. How is it learned and developed? Through role modeling. Have we done a great job? No. Should we feel shame about that? No. We do the best we can. But when we know better, we do better. When we don't know, we don't allow ourselves to beat ourselves up. But once we know, we got to do better. So we can't continue pretending that we're fine all the time. In fact, Glennon Doyle, who's another wonderful author and speaker and thinker, she has been sober for, I think, 20 years. And she talks about her sobriety and says, I have not been fine one day in my life since becoming sober. I have been joyous and thrilled and devastated and incredibly anxious. I have been the full spectrum of human emotions. We cannot allow ourselves to continue perpetuating this myth that we can be fine. There is no such thing as fine. And when we ask each other how we are, we usually say fine or good, or we'll say I'm tired or exhausted, or we'll say I'm stressed or busy, because those are acceptable answers. When people ask me how I am during this pandemic, if I ever say I'm actually doing really well, they look at me like I have 5 heads. So we have to be able to openly and honestly share how we are. And that doesn't mean sharing all the nasty details of our life, especially with our children. But if we come home from an experience out in the world, or we get off our screen, or we wake up and we're not in a good space, it's okay to simply say, I'm not feeling great today. And if you're picking up on that energy from me, please know it has nothing to do with you, but I'm struggling. And then we normalize and we allow our child or the people in our lives' anxiety to reduce when their imagination is spinning out from that emotional contagion that it's because of them and they've done something. We can reduce that anxiety and give them permission to be vulnerable, all in the same moment. But it takes our own vulnerability to do so. So let's talk about brain chemistry for a moment. And I don't know if you can see, because I know it's blocking the gallery view is blocking these words, but underneath the picture on the left, it says allostasis. And underneath the picture on the right, it says homeostasis. And if you think about your brain, I have taken this brain model from the fabulous Dan Siegel, who wrote Brainstorm, who likes to demonstrate the brain like this. If my fingers represent wizard brain, which is our prefrontal cortex, our receptive brain, it's the part of our brain that does all the really important executive functions that we're always trying to strengthen, our organization, our impulse control, our problem solving skills, our ability to prioritize and task initiation, all of those things, super important. But when our stress response is triggered, guess what happens? Gone. We no longer have access to this part of our brain. It's like you've lost a Wi-Fi signal. And now your lizard brain, your reptilian brain, which is fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. For those of you who have not heard fawn, trauma research over the last couple of years has added that to fight, flight, freeze as another trauma response, which is when we meet the needs of everyone around us in order to keep ourselves safe, which is also known as being a people pleaser. So meeting everybody else's needs, sometimes at the expense of your own. When we are in lizard brain, our body is trying to protect us from danger. When there's no actual danger in the moment, we are in danger of staying here for a really long time. And that is really damaging to our body. So homeostasis is when everything's in balance. That's when we're here. Allostasis is when things come out of balance. And what can happen if we're at allostasis for too long is we get this allostatic load, which causes brain fog. It causes a really short fuse, both for a response of anger as well as anxiety. So things that maybe might not have triggered us as much before, we are having a really strong response to. And allostatic load is incredibly damaging to our bodies. It's damaging to our immune systems. It's damaging to our brain functioning. It's incredibly important that we recognize how much harder we're making our lives when we let ourselves stay in that place. So Emily and Amelia Nagoski are sisters who wrote this book, Burnout: The Secret to Unlocking the Stress Cycle, which is in my works cited at the end. And this quote blew my mind when I heard it. Trying to deal with your stress by solving your stressors is like trying to aid your digestion by doing the dishes. So what they are saying is we're not going to deal with allostatic load by getting it all done, right? Anybody who has tried to get through their to-do list in an attempt to soften the edges of their anxiety is pretty aware that that to-do list keeps expanding. It's like multiplying on its own, it seems. So trying to deal with that feeling in our bodies by taking care of things is as effective as trying to deal with your digestion by doing the dishes, which means it's really actually not effective at all. So what do? We remember that the inside belongs to us. Our internal landscape belongs to us. We may have no control out there, but if you remember when I was talking about thinking about worst case versus best case scenario and how that impacts our body, our insides are much more in our control than the outside world. This cognitive triangle is what exhibits how our body and our brain function together. Our thoughts are what cause our feelings. Our feelings are what impact our behaviors. and our behaviors reinforce our thoughts. So if I believe I can't manage stress, then I'm going to feel powerless and helpless. I might behave in ways that just distract and numb, which just bring me right back to, see, you can't manage stress. And it's not helpful at all. So again, Viktor Frankl, who I mentioned a minute ago, the Holocaust survivor and Austrian psychologist, this quote is the cornerstone of my clinical work. Between stimulus and response, there's a space. You might be shocked to hear that, because I know many people that I talk to, including myself, sometimes feel like there's no space. When I'm triggered, there's just a reaction. There's no space. But believe it or not, there really is. And we can drive a wedge into that space and open it. So again, between stimulus and response, there's a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. And in our response lies our growth and our freedom. Why growth and freedom? Because if you have ever done anything that you later regretted when you were angry, you understand that there is nothing freeing about that experience. It is disempowering. It feels like you've been hijacked, and it often leads to more shame. So when we recognize that we have the capacity to drive a wedge between stimulus and response and open it up so that we can feel empowered to choose, how are we going to respond to this situation? Also using that time to take our brain from a lizard state to a wizard state so that we can actually problem solve and not just react. But what often happens when we feel that stress response is we criticize ourselves right away. I can't handle stress. See, I messed up. I knew I would. I can never do this. I suck, and on and on and on. And what this self-criticism does is keeps us here. It perpetuates allostasis, which leads to allostatic load. It decreases motivation as a result of that allostatic load and impacts our relationships not in super happy, positive ways. Self-compassion, on the other hand, triggers our nurturing response, increases motivation, builds connection, and is really, really hard to do. I'll get back to that in a moment. The other thing that we do that makes our life a little bit more challenging when that stress response is triggered for whatever reason is by rejecting the experience. And there are a lot of philosophies out there in the world that believe that pain is part of being a human being. Suffering comes from our resistance to pain. That if we can accept and move through and cope with and deal with our pain, then we are much more likely to move through it with post-traumatic growth than when we reject it and say, I don't want this to happen. This isn't normal. When are we going to go back to normal? Then we stay stuck. We stay paralyzed. We're not engaging in our lives. We're keeping ourselves in the stress response, and we are exacerbating everything that we're trying to soften. One of the first things that we can do to address that is to settle into what we're feeling. That we retract from difficult emotions like we retract from a hot stove. But if I leave my fingers on a hot stove, I am very definitely going to get a pretty bad burn. If I allow myself to sit with anxiety or sadness, that's not going to happen. What's actually going to happen is my body will find a way back to homeostasis, even when the feelings feel like they're going to break us into a million pieces. But what we do to ourselves and to other people in our lives is we say, calm down, settle down, you're fine, relax, it's going to be okay. Why? If we could just settle into the experience, I'm not talking about unpacking and moving in, just settling into the experience by doing something as simple as I notice that I'm anxious. The other day I was doing dishes and I started feeling this wave of anxiety come over me. I wasn't even sure why, but I felt my feet on the floor and I noticed that I felt anxious and I focused on my breath. And after several minutes, it was softer. It wasn't gone, but it was softer. If I had tried to force it, if I had tried to reject that feeling, it would have stayed with me a lot longer. And we do this a lot with children because we're task oriented. Understandably, we have things that need to get done in our lives. And when our children are manifesting their emotions through behavior, it's a lot easier to try to control that than to try to meet them where they're at. And when I had a toddler, when my daughter was 3 and she would have fits, again, this was not because I was brilliant. It was because I was just doing what instinctively I thought I should do in the moment. And fortunately, it was right. I would lay down on the floor with her and say, it's really hard to be 3, isn't it? Until she calmed down. If I had been telling her to calm down, she would have felt not heard. And when we do that to ourselves, we are rejecting our own emotional experience and we feel unheard. So all human beings experience anger, anxiety, and sadness in the face of stress and overwhelm. All of us. Those are the primary three emotions that we feel. And they happen on a spectrum. And if we imagine it as a river that gets increasingly deep and ferocious, if we fall into that river of those emotions and recognize it right away without shame and without denial, there are many things that we can use to climb out. If we fall in and we right away are either denying it or too afraid to admit it, then we get to where the water's deeper and now we need help. We need to ask for help. We need to be able to be vulnerable enough to admit that we need help. And sometimes it's really hard to do that. So we end up where the water is so deep and the water is so violent and the waterfall is approaching that we lean into the things that numb and distract us. And I don't just mean really scary, dangerous things. I mean things as simple as our phones. Our distress tolerance as a society is something we really need to work on. And it's part of resiliency and what young people are learning from us. So mindful self-compassion, going back to self-compassion and how hard it is, there is a mindful self-compassion curriculum that was developed by Christopher Germer and Kristen Neff. And it is based on these three areas: self-kindness, mindfulness, and common humanity. Common humanity is that feeling of normalizing discomfort. I am not alone in this. Everyone is struggling with this. Everyone has struggled with this at some point, whatever it is that you're going through. The mindfulness is the settling in, letting yourself feel what you're feeling without exaggerating it with hyperbole and also without minimizing it. And then the self-kindness is incredibly challenging to do ourselves, which is why I really love the modality of therapy called internal family systems. And the easiest way to understand internal family systems is to think of the movie Inside Out. And in the movie Inside Out, the characters' parts were represented by little emotions, little characters that represented emotions. In internal family systems, our parts are really us at every age we've ever been. They're all the voices that have influenced us in our lives. And so the way that I use this as a point of accessing self-compassion is I was on television when I was a child and until I was 9. And it really adversely impacted me in that as a child, not really understanding rejection versus winning an audition, I just thought arbitrarily that people were making decisions about whether or not I was good enough. And that fed a lot of social anxiety and performance anxiety in my life. And what's funny is I did theater for a long time. Playing a character, no big deal. Presenting as myself, huge anxiety. So what I started to do was imagining my child self standing next to me right before I do a presentation and speaking to her, saying, I can feel that you're anxious, but I've got this, I promise. You don't have to worry about this. I can take care of it. So self-compassion is one of those things that, yeah, if it was as easy as talking to ourselves the way we would talk to other people, great, but it's not. And so if we can personify and externalize the part of us that's hurting, it allows us the opportunity to access that critical compassion. So when we look at that thought, feeling, behavior cycle, behavior is where everybody wants to focus. Stop doing that. It's unhealthy. That's not effective. We know that. We can't change our feelings, right? Those are primal. So our thoughts are where we have our power, right? But look at that first question. What evidence do I have that this is true? And what evidence do I have to the contrary? I love this question, but I love this question for things like, I'm going to fail this test, not I'm not good enough. Because I'm not good enough is one of those negative core beliefs that we can argue with ourselves over and over, but it's like a boomerang. It's going to keep coming back. So for those deeply held core beliefs that affect our resiliency and our confidence, I jump right to the second question. How is paying attention to this story going to help me? How is paying attention to this thought going to help me function more effectively? It's actually more likely to harm me. So thinking about how to access those parts that we can offer self-compassion to, and how to filter all of the many thoughts, like celebrities filter all of the tabloid stories. If they paid attention to all of them, if they tried to argue all of them, they'd be wasting so much energy. So we can't pay attention to every story that we tell ourselves. Stress is not always harmful, and I highly recommend watching this TED Talk to understand why. Stress is something that we feel when something we care about is at stake. and it's harmful when we're afraid of it. But if you're feeling it and you're in allostasis, what can you do? Scuba safety stops are designed to protect scuba divers as they're coming to the surface from releasing the buildup of nitrogen in their bodies before they come up, becoming more aware of their surroundings, and pausing and regaining a sense of control. We have to do the same thing when we're stressed because we have to release the cortisol buildup in our body. We have to pause and regain our wizard brain. We need to become more aware of our surroundings. How do we do that? Emily and Amelia Nagoski, the authors of Burnout that I mentioned earlier, give us 7 different ways of doing this. And the first one is to move your body, not because of all the health benefits of exercise, which admittedly are profound, but because when our brain is in fight, flight, and freeze, it wants us to move out of the way of danger. So even if we do 10 jumping jacks, our nervous system says, oh, we are now out of the way of danger. So moving your body is incredibly important when you feel that buildup of stress. Breathing. When we inhale, we trigger our sympathetic nervous system, which is our fight, flight, freeze, and fawn response. When we exhale, we trigger our parasympathetic nervous system, our rest and digest response. So all day, like pistons, our breath is balancing the two. But when we are stressed, we tend to hold our breath. We tend to have shallow breathing because we are bracing ourselves. So if you let out your breath, you trigger the rest and digest response, you bring your parasympathetic nervous system online, and you're more likely to be able to re-engage that wizard brain. Imagining, as I talked about earlier, if you can imagine the worst case scenario, you can imagine a best case scenario. And I love this quote, that it makes sense that your imagination would be able to complete a stress response cycle because we already know that it can activate a stress response cycle. So if our imagination can come up with this really scary thing that causes us to feel anxiety in our body, it can also come up with another option, another possibility that perhaps can, again, soften the edges of that stress response in our bodies. Creative self-expression, finding a place to put all of our big emotions. And this isn't just about art and music. This can be cooking, this can be baking, working on a bike, working on a car, knitting, anything that allows you to put your energy into something. Crying and not crying, thinking while you're crying, why am I crying? I wish I weren't crying. I hate crying. This is so stupid that I'm crying. I shouldn't be crying. None of those things are helpful. When we cry, our body is releasing energy like the valve on a pressure cooker. So as they say, if you attend to the physical experience of crying, it's not going to last more than 5 to 7 minutes. The reason why we struggle so much with crying is we try to stifle it, even when we're alone, as though it is a sign of weakness, when actually it is a physiological release of energy, as is laughter. Both leave you with this really calm sense in your torso. And depending on whether the experience was a happy cry or a sad cry, you might be left with a wistfulness, but it's a softened, the edges of the sadness have been softened. So we have to let ourselves have these emotional experiences, or again, the finite container of our body makes it really challenging. Connecting, they say feelings are tunnels and we have to go all the way through the darkness to get to the light at the end. Connecting with people means that maybe they're walking with us through the tunnel, or maybe they're standing at the end saying, hey, it's over here and I'm waiting for you. But there's lots of different types of connection. There's superficial social connection, which I hate. And I know so many people who are gifted hate. Small talk is not fun. But when we engage with people that we have no social connection to other than we share the world with them, and we say, hi, how are you? I like your mask, nice shirt, beautiful weather. We're reminding ourselves that the world is a safe place to be, that we don't have to be hypervigilant and afraid of everyone. Intimate connection, they say that if you hug someone for 20 seconds or kiss someone for 6 seconds, both of which might feel awkward and uncomfortable, but if there's someone that you feel safe enough to do this with, I encourage you to try. Your body drops into a sense of safety. Your breathing starts to align. And our bodies, when our stress response is triggered, one of the hormones that we secrete is oxytocin, the cuddle hormone, because our body wants us to connect with someone. It's trying to inspire us to connect with someone. So if you are able to access hugs or maybe kisses, I encourage you to try that and see what you feel in your body. Hugging is incredibly important. Connection with nature. broadening our perspective out of these screens into a bigger world, remembering that we're part of a global ecosystem, that we're part of a natural world and an animal kingdom. Talk about bringing perspective to your life. It's profound. And spiritual connection. Whether or not you're someone who observes an organized religion, spirituality and religion are not mutually exclusive. Religion may be somebody's path to spirituality, 100%. But I love Brene Brown's definition of spirituality, which is recognizing and celebrating that we're all inextricably connected to each other by a power greater than all of us, and that our connection to that power and to one another is grounded in love and compassion. That power greater than all of us might be a higher power, if that's your belief system. It might also be nature. It might also be our culture. It might be our community. Whatever it is that makes you feel like you are part of something bigger than yourself, that allows you to feel connected to love and belonging. That is spiritual connection. And all of these things help us lean towards a collectivist attitude. We don't want to be entirely collectivist as a society because sometimes that really squelches individual voices. But we're an incredibly individualistic society right now and have been for a long time, that really is all about how much we can get ahead, how much we can consume for ourselves, how much we can protect ourselves. Collectivist societies recognize that we need each other, that we need to look at how we can build communities of strength and lean with each other, not lean against, not lean on, not lean in even, but lean with, so that we can all feel supported. And I'm going to end with this. Most people hear these presentations and go, that's a lot of stuff you want me to do, Jenny. And I don't know what you're thinking, because my to-do list, even though it's not going to help with my allostasis, is really long and I've got a lot to do. So I don't know when you think I'm going to put my time into this stuff. Well, I will share this with you. Sean Achor, who's a positive psychology researcher at Harvard University and also has a wonderful TED Talk that I believe is on my works cited page, says that our brain at positive is 31% more productive than our brain in a negative, stressed, or even neutral state. Here, when your brain is here in lizard brain, you are giving up 31% of its potential functioning. That to-do list is not going to be any easier if you force yourself to do it. In fact, if you invest the time and front load the time to build your resilience and re-engage your wizard brain, you get your creativity back. I told you I'd come back to that connection between resiliency and creativity. You get your creativity, your critical thinking, all of your executive functions back, which makes those minutiae a lot easier to deal with. But we've got to focus on the baseline. That is where our resiliency is born. If you're interested in learning more from any of the books or TED Talks that I cited, this is a list of wonderful, wonderful authors. And then on my last page is my contact information. And I want to share with you that I started in November a weekly video series of 15 to 20 minute videos that are about resiliency and emotional wellness and offering. I'm a curator of audiobooks and podcasts and all kinds of information that I love to share. Right now, we're going through Brene Brown's 10 guideposts for wholehearted living. And these are streamed live on my Still Rising community page. The link is below. And actually, I don't, oh yeah, it's in the, it says streamed live on. And then I post them on the next day on my KARUNA Healing Facebook, Instagram pages, and my website. So if you're interested in continuing to engage in this learning and conversation, I invite you to join me. And I'm happy to answer any questions folks may have at this time.
Jenny, thank you so much. As always, you're just such a joy to listen to. This is an opportunity. If any of you have a question that you'd like to type in the chat, we have big thanks to Jody Mueller. She's our Greeley Evans District 6 hostess tonight, and she's going to help me read some of them. And if you don't, I want to thank you all for this evening and would ask that you continue to be great advocates for our gifted learners and take care of yourself as well as stay healthy. I know our evening's getting on, but if you do have a question, please feel free. Otherwise, travel safely to your next room, I guess, so you get away from your computer, right?
Thank you to everyone who's sending me thank yous in the chat. I appreciate you being here so much.
Reading lots of thank yous for you. I think I think your resource that they can connect with later too, Jenny, is awesome with your weekly podcasts. And I'm just seeing lots of thank yous.
Thank you. So somebody wrote, I don't really see how this is specific to raising a gifted child, and that's, though it's helpful for my own stress. And I appreciate you bringing that up. And let me speak to that for a moment. The piece that's specific is the fact that gifted individuals have that heightened sensitivity and intensity. And due to those specific overexcitabilities, things like sensory overexcitability are going to make being in the home all the time with their family maybe more heightened. The emotional overexcitability is going to increase the empathy. Imaginational overexcitability is going to increase worst case scenario. So it's not specific that gifted individuals are going to need anything different. It's that we need them more. It's that we have to be even more aware of how challenging this experience is for people who are gifted because of all those overexcitabilities and the heightened perceptivity, the heightened perfectionism, the heightened awareness. But yes, I often have people coming up to me at the end of my talk saying, you know, this feels like it's really would be of service to a lot of people. So I do this presentation for communities that are not specific to the GT population, and I don't talk about all of that stuff. And then I do bring it in when I talk to the gifted population. But if people have questions more specific to the gifted population from this talk, please feel free to reach out. I'm happy to receive emails and would be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Awesome. Jenny, thank you so much. I appreciate everybody joining us tonight.
Sure.
One of the big questions is, can people see it? It was recorded, and so we'll put it up on the website. It'll be a limited amount of time. We don't leave it forever. We want Jenny to still be able to go and talk with people live. But for the few of you that want to reconnect with it, it'll be there for a little bit, and it'll be through your district coordinator. So again, thank you everyone, and we hope you have a great evening.
Thank you.